Okay, good. So let's officially get started. My name is Joyce Raimondo, and I'm the education coordinator at the Pollock Krasner House and Study Center in East Hampton, New York. We're located about 100 miles east of New York City in a small area called the Springs. And right now I'm sitting in Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner's art studio. So today we have a special topic, dynamic duos. And this is about creative art couples. And as I was researching this topic, I thought to myself, well, there's so many benefits of being in an art couple. You can inspire each other, you could support each other, you could even collaborate. But then there can be some drawbacks too. Maybe one person overshadows the other. And of course, in the 1940s and 50s, when Pollock and Krasner were working, there was tremendous sexism in the art world, and also very constricted gender roles, which played into some difficulties for the women. So I'm going to give a little disclaimer before I give the talk. I am a woman, so I'm probably seeing these relationships a little bit from a woman's viewpoint. Okay, so if that filters into the talk a little bit, just understand this is a very, some of this is somewhat subjective, what you choose to highlight and whatnot, but I'm going to stick with the facts. So let's start with Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock, okay? I'm going to do a little screen share and then we'll go into the barn. So here is an iconic photo taken of Pollock and Krasner. And of course, it was taken by Hans Namath in 1950. And of course, Jackson Pollock is best known for his drip painting. And I'm going to take you into the studio where he made his iconic drip paintings. And I am going to also weave in the story of their lives, focusing on their relationship as a couple. Okay, so let's get started with that. And I'm going to fill in some more details today than I usually do about the dynamic as I understand it, based on what I've read, what I've been told, and what I imagine. Okay, so of course the highlight when you come to the studio is Pollock's floor. Pollock and Lee did not work in the studio together. Lee worked in a room upstairs in the house while Pollock worked in the barn studio. And they moved to the property in 1945 and they purchased the house and the studio. And I'll show you the property when we take a break in between, okay? So let's start with some of these photos that tell the story of their relationship. So here's a photo of Lee in 1945 in her 8th Street studio, and Pollock in his 8th Street studio in 1943. So how did this couple meet? Well, there's sort of two stories, but Lee usually would tell the story of how they were both in an exhibit at the Macmillan Gallery, and she knew everyone in the art world. She was so active as an abstract artist in New York City. And Pollock was in this exhibit. She had never heard of him, so she was really curious. And she found out where his studio was, and she went over there unannounced. And when she got there, his brother Charles was in the hallway. She said, "Do you know where Jackson Pollock's studio is?" And she just boldly knocked on the door. And she took an immediate interest in his work, and they became lovers. They became a couple. And when they moved out here to the Springs, they married, and prior to that, they lived together. Now, there is another story. As it turns out, they had met years before that at a dance, but they didn't really connect, so Lee didn't really make anything of it. She recalled later on, "Oh yeah, I met this guy. He was a very sloppy dancer," and she said he was drunk and he stepped on her foot, okay? But she usually tells the story more from the significant meeting was through that art exhibit. Now, Lee understood that Pollock did have a drinking problem, And she forged ahead with the relationship anyway, and she figured she could handle it. And Lee made a conscious decision that she was going to manage Pollock's career and put her own career on the back burner to support his. And as a couple, they decided that he would be the breadwinner, as most men were in those days, in the 40s. And that being said, Lee never stopped painting. So you might hear from different people. I went to a talk the other night and the person said, oh, Pollock didn't want her to paint. He was jealous or whatever. And Lee didn't paint. That's really not true. When they met and they were living in New York City, Lee was blocked. So she would work and work the same painting over and over again. But she never would have allowed herself to stop painting. She would not have any of that. Okay? So Lee was excellent at managing Pollock's career, and she negotiated with Peggy Guggenheim so that they could buy the house in the Springs, which is right here. And Lee also negotiated that Peggy Guggenheim would give Pollock a monthly stipend. And so he didn't have to worry about selling his work or working at another job. So they were pretty set. They did live initially. It was a difficult life out here. There was no running, there was no plumbing, there was no central heat in the house. So it was really tough country living. But they had a really good life. They had 2 dogs. They had a pet crow, Caw-Caw, and life was actually really good. They would go to the beach. They would pick up clams, for example, and make beautiful meals from the clams or the garden, and just that kind of happy life that a couple would enjoy, right? And a lot of young couples start off with humble beginnings and struggle at the beginning. So it really wasn't different in that sense for Pollock and Krasner, okay? Now, Pollock was sober for 2 years. He sought help from a psychiatrist. And also, of course, things were going well because he was sober. And his career was advancing. How exciting is that? Okay? And financially, they started to do quite well. They both could work on their art. They had land, they had a car, a home. So this is the American dream, isn't it? Everything was going well. And, you know, there's no set answer as to why someone would start drinking again. If we could figure it out, whoever could figure out that exact answer would get very rich, because a lot of people relapse. And it's hard to tell why. So in Pollock's case, he had risen to fame. Now, Lee was really managing his career, keeping it all together for him. Sometimes she would even kind of tell him what to say a little bit when people would interview him. So she was very fiercely involved in his success as an artist. Now, before I get to the downfall part, how did they influence each other as artists? Well, Lee introduced Pollock to many of the modern artists of that era, like Picasso, and it was a very rich intellectual and creative life for the 2 of them, going to the Museum of Modern Art, going into the city, meeting with other artists. They were not isolated at all, okay? So they could share ideas about this. It was called advanced art, modern art, art that's breaking new ground, art that's designed to take what's on the inside and express that in a very physical way, okay? Now, Lee was very supportive of Pollock's work. She was always available to comment on it. And sometimes Pollock, you know, he would be struggling, or just because it was so new, it was so groundbreaking, it was like an adventure into the unknown. And there's a famous quote. Pollock said to Lee, "Not, is this a good painting?" He said, "Lee, is this a painting?" And I just love that quote. It just shows so much humility. Now, on the other hand, I've heard that when Lee would ask Pollock for advice, she kind of had to pull it out of him. He was more reticent. He wasn't as verbal as a person in general, okay? So another aspect to their relationship, Pollock wanted to have children, and Lee did not. I think it's pretty understandable that almost all the women of this abstract expressionist era, except for one, Grace Hardigan, did not have children. Because to have a child at that time, as a woman, you would have probably been solely focused on the aspects of motherhood and a domestic life. And it would have been very difficult to have an art career at all. And also Pollock it was a lot of responsibility for Lee anyway, right? So sadly, when Pollock, everything is going well, and then he's at the peak of his fame, Hans Namath, and this was a gradual process. This was like hard work on both of their parts, right? And now his art is selling, and Hans Namath, the photographer, comes to shoot photos, this being one of them, of Pollock's process, and to make a film about Pollock. Pollock was also featured, I think I showed you this, in Life magazine. Okay, so he's also getting media acclaim. And no one knows exactly why. He's filming with Hans Namath, and everything's going well. And they have people over, you know, Lee would cook and have the other artists and critics and, you know, creatives over. Everything's well, it's a beautiful evening. And Pollock comes in, and it is a true story, it's in the movie with Ed Harris. And all of a sudden he grabs the bottle, drinks, and says, now, like crazy. And he takes the table and he tips it, and all the food slides off the table. And according to people who were there, they said Lee's just looked heartbroken. Like she knew what was going to happen if he started drinking again. And she was composed, and she just continued with the dinner party and said to people, would you like coffee? And they went into the parlor, and that was that. And the rest of Pollock's career, and his, well, not his career, but his mental state rapidly declined. So he went into a depression, and he did really crazy things when he was drinking. One time Lee had an exhibit of her mosaic table in a gallery, and she really didn't have that much opportunity to show. So it was a really big deal for her. And they went back to the gallery owner's house, apartment in New York City. It was filled with antiques and whatnot. And Pollock started drinking, and he just went berserk, and he started smashing all the antiques. And Lee was just like, probably, I can't even imagine. So this is not unique to Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner, is it? If you've ever lived with an alcoholic, which I have, my brother was an alcoholic. Sadly, this is what people do when they're in an acute phase of alcoholism. And they might not even remember it the next day. So that's why it's so heartbreaking, because you know how much you love that person and respect them and admire them, and you see them decline, and there's not a darn thing you can do about it. So Lee tried to get Pollock help. There was a lapse in his treatment. His doctor had passed away. And so she tried to get him help. It didn't work. And Pollock started an affair with Ruth Kligman, a younger woman. He used to come into the barn with Ruth and have shenanigans, as they say, and Lee would be in the house, and she was very stressed, obviously. She went to Paris. She was gonna come back. And while she was away, Pollock invited the mistress, or actually the mistress was already here. The mistress invited her friend Edith Metzger to come for a nice weekend, and Pollock was driving and drinking with the two of them, and the only survivor was the mistress, Ruth. So Pollock died, he was 44 years old. It was a horrible accident. The car toppled over, he was thrown, he was dead on the spot. So Lee comes back. That was 1956. Lee comes back from Europe and resumes her creativity in this barn studio, painting out all of her emotions, her energy, and moving through the grief process, and even coming in here at night after her mom passed away. And she remains on the property for the rest of her life. She used to pin her paintings to the wall, and you could see where her paint splattered up there. And Lee and Pollock are action painters because they're using their whole body in a very physical way. And at the end of her life, Lee was a very wealthy woman. She was the sole inheritor of Pollock's estate. And she did, of course, also have a place in New York City. She never remarried. Now, for Lee, she wanted to be known not as a woman artist, not as Pollock's wife, right? All along, every interviewer, they'd go to interview Lee. What did they start asking her about? Your husband, Jackson Pollock, right? It must have been annoying, I imagine. Anyway, so Lee said she didn't want to be known as a woman artist. I am an artist, right? I am not just the wife of Jackson Pollock. Yes, that's part of her story. And as a couple, you can't separate them in a sense because Lee was so instrumental in Pollock's success, right? As a business person. And because of that, Lee was instrumental to the success of the whole group of abstract expressionists, okay? And of course, today, Lee has had many retrospectives in all the major, not all, but the major museums, and her work sells for millions of dollars. Do we have any questions so far? Anyone unmute? Questions, comments, thoughts?
Yeah, wow, this is really hitting me where I live. Because this is like a passion of mine. So I mean, and some of it, and I love Lee Krasner's work. I love her stuff as well. Actually, probably my, another one of my paintings in my top 5 is one of hers called Towards One. It's a big, huge work in just gorgeous, like bright pink and a couple shades of green and gold. And it's just wonderful. And it's actually, I'm lucky enough, it's just actually right down the street at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. So it's like a mile and a half away. So, but it seems to me, and maybe I'm just misinterpreting. It seemed like in a lot of the interviews I've seen of hers, she really seemed to try to make an effort to say that she did not subsume her career for Pollock. And I kind of appreciated what she still kept painting. I knew that, but she could have, she was more well known in that world before Pollock was. So by all rights, she could have kept exhibiting. She could have kept showing. And it seemed like in a lot of the interviews I've seen with her, she really took pains to try to say, and maybe I'm just not interpreting them right, I don't know, that she really took pains to try to say, no, I was not prevented from doing things like that. But I think with all the responsibility she had with Pollock, I mean, he was a full-time job in and of himself. So I don't know. I get a lot of sense, and maybe it's just part of my own bias coming in, just a lot of sense of defensiveness in her in a lot of interviews that I see.
Yeah, me. Yeah, very good point. You said a couple of things. One is sometimes today, young women in general women in general might project their feelings onto Lee Krasner of how they would feel in that situation. But Lee, I have never heard any reports or anything written that Lee resented Pollock or felt forced into this. It was
I don't think she resented it necessarily, but
no, I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah.
I'm agreeing with you. Yeah, that she made a conscious choice. And that she at the same time, when she was being interviewed, I think there's a defensiveness because it was probably a little, it's a touchy subject, first off. It's a personal subject, your relationship with your husband. And also, sometimes I think she got defensive because they would sway away talking about her work and sway into talking about her as Mrs. Pollock. Right. But your point is well taken. She did not report a resentment against Pollock. She did it with poise and grace and amazing intelligence. She supported his career because she loved his art and she loved him. And she believed that he was a genius. She didn't have a problem with that.
Yeah. And so, something else that just that sticks in my craw as far as how everything ended. And I don't know if this is something that's been asked about in a tour or talked about or anything like that. Ruth Klingman actually sued the estate for her medical bills after the wreck. She sued Lee Krasner and the estate for like helping to pay her medical bills after the accident that killed Pollock and Edith Metzger. So that's,
yeah, I don't know much about that, but that's sort of a separate topic that you could delve into. And
there's all sorts of,
if you want to read her account, she did write a memoir. Ruth.
I own it. I own it.
It's a good book.
It's interesting.
It's a good point you bring up. Just for the sake of, because I want to get to the other
exactly. And something else, another great book that I own is like the Nine Women book, which is just, oh God, I just love that book. And there even seem, and maybe you'll address this, or again, maybe it's my own bias, there even seemed to be a little bit of a tension between Lee and some of those artists. Some of the other women.
Like Elaine.
Yes.
Sometimes, well, according to that book, sometimes Lee would get a little jealous. She would feel a little insecure about Jackson Pollock, giving maybe other women attention and that sort of thing. And there was sometimes some competition. But on that note, I do want to show you this picture. And then we'll pan out to other artists here. This picture is called The Irascibles. And this got Lee mad. So this is a concrete example of sexism when you're part of a couple. It wasn't Pollock's fault, but Lee had always been active in the art world and, gathering together artists. She had worked for the WPA, et cetera, et cetera. And then she gets a call that they were going to write a letter to the Met in protest because they weren't showing this new advanced art. I forget who called her, but the guy calls and said, oh yeah, can I speak to Jackson Pollock? And then Pollock gets off the phone and Lee is like, wait a minute, like, why are they inviting you and they're not inviting me? That annoyed her, right? And then later on, this is the famous iconic photo, which shows the abstract expressionists from that group who signed the letter. And what's missing? There's only one woman, Hedda Stern. So this is what these female artists were up against. And here is Lee's quote. She said, I couldn't run out and do a one-woman job on the sexist aspects of the art world. Continue my
Joyce, can I ask a question?
In one moment, let me just read this, okay?
Okay.
And stay in the role as I was in Mrs. Pollock. What I considered important was that I was able to do the work. So she knew, she couldn't fight the whole system that was arising. She could continue her work. Yes, Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, in the picture that you showed before this one, the group of artists, it looks like there's a shadow behind the woman standing, but the shadow looks like a man in a man's hat.
I know, it's weird, and that is just that Hedda Stern's shadow. And it's extremely strange that she's at the top of the photo posed like that. And why is she the only woman artist? I've asked about this to the director, and there's no clear-cut answer.
Oh.
And she kind of regretted being in the photo, by the way, because she said for the rest of her life, this is what she was known for, being the only woman in this photo.
Okay.
But yeah, it is a strange photo. And Jackson Pollock, of course, is right in the middle.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, so let's continue. And here is the book that that person mentioned. Ninth Street Women is a very good follow-up to this program. It will keep you occupied during the stay-home pandemic because it's like 850 pages. And it reads, it's just very dramatic. It's a really good book, has so much detail. So next up is Elaine and Willem de Kooning. And Elaine and Willem were part of this group from the New York art scene, right? Because you've imagined Pollock and Krasner and all these artists, you know, hanging out in New York City in the 30s and 40s. And so they, according to accounts, fell madly in love when they met. And they were kind of opposites in the sense that Bill was more antisocial, he was more reclusive. And Elaine was very, very social. She was very dynamic, brilliant, very attractive, and she just had that kind of personality where people wanted to be around her. So at that time, many women used to wind up supporting their husbands financially so the husband could paint. So starting out, Elaine and Willem, they were really, really poor. They really led the bohemian artist life. So for example, the story goes, they were so poor that they got ketchup and put hot water in it and called it soup. But eventually Elaine started to work for Art News. She was a very talented writer. And she wrote about the artists. She was a critic, but she wrote about them in a way where she wouldn't just write about them of like going to the exhibit. She would go to their studios and really write about their process. So in doing this, she was promoting all the abstract artists who were not a commercial success at that time. And she always promoted as well her husband's work. But unlike Lee, she didn't sort of put her own career on the back burner, okay? Excuse me, there was something else I was gonna say about that. Oh yeah, well, one of the problems in their marriage was that Willem kind of wanted a little bit more of a traditional wife, someone who would be cooking and caring for him and that kind of thing. Elaine didn't really take to that. She wanted to be out, she wanted to socialize, she wanted to paint, and she wasn't going to fall into that role. So that was a problem in their marriage, but they did have this deep bond, enjoying each other's company and enjoying the art process as well, right? So at the beginning of their marriage or their relationship, de Kooning used to teach his wife, well, I don't know if they were married at the time, but he would teach Elaine drawing instructions. He was trained, as you could see here, in traditional techniques. And she said it was just amazing, amazing instruction. And eventually, de Kooning starts to paint in this expressionistic way. He's one of the abstract expressionists. This is his very famous series. This is called Woman One. And he painted these women. They're very fierce. They're very almost ugly, warrior-like, have masculine qualities. And he like imbues it with this energy where it's like scraping and swiping. And it has this really aggressive, almost violent feeling to it. What he would do is he would actually start off with a picture from a magazine of like the typical kind of woman that was, you know, in the media back then, right? Like a pinup girl type of woman. And then he would paint this on top of it, covering up that image. Now, there's many different interpretations of this picture. We're not going to get into that. And it certainly is not a portrait of Elaine de Kooning at all, but it was made towards the end of their marriage when their marriage was falling apart. Now, one of the reasons the marriage fell apart was on both of their parts, there was infidelity. But, you know, it was, these artists were very free within that scene with their sexuality, so to speak. And okay, there was something else. Oh, well, there was also an issue. Elaine had gone away with man sailing, and it was strictly platonic. But de Kooning got really jealous, and that put a little rift in their marriage as well. They were both also very heavy drinkers, and that didn't help their relationship. However, after if I said divorced, I meant separated, by the way. That was a mistake. They separated, but they remained close. And here's a portrait that Elaine did of Willem. You could see hers is much more expressive. I mean, it's expressionism. This is the two of them in their older years. Of course, Willem rose to fame and financial success, as did Elaine. And at the end of his life, he lived till he was 92. But as I think when he was in his 80s, Willem started to get dementia. And Elaine moved to East Hampton, right down the block, not the block, but right in the area, close proximity to his studio. And they were very close. She really took care of him, and she tried to protect him, sometimes even trying to cover for him and his dementia. If somebody came over, she would make a joke and make like, oh, like he didn't really say, that kind of thing. And on the right is an example of his painting in his older years. It turned out Elaine also did go into recovery. She was in sobriety, and she wound up dying of emphysema much younger than him, and he lived till 92. And both of them, which was unusual for the abstract expressionists, both of them wound up painting the figure. So you see on the right, Elaine is painting her commission of JFK, and he's painting his female figures, or that might be the clam digger, I'm not sure, on the left. So that was unusual for this group of abstract artists. Also, de Kooning, he never stopped drinking. And in fact, when he was younger, he had a nervous problem, and the doctor actually advised him to start drinking. So go figure that. And he did have a daughter with another woman, and his grandchildren still live in the area, or at least they did until recently. Maybe they moved, but they were brought up in the area of the Springs, and the daughter lived in the house for many years in that same house. And de Kooning's studio is still intact, but it's not a public site at this point. Okay, any questions? Ideas?
Weren't there two houses not that far apart either?
Yes.
The Pollock Krasner house and the de Koonings?
Very good.
Their houses weren't very far apart, were they?
No, they're both in the Springs, and they're both in the same neighborhood. Yeah, absolutely.
I think even Bill de Kooning is even buried in the same cemetery as
Yeah,
Lee and
they're both buried at the Green River Cemetery, and many of the artists from that era are buried there as well. Yeah, and they were friends. They had friendly competition. Pollock rose to fame before Willem de Kooning. Okay, next up is Helen Frankenthaler and Clement Greenberg. Now, I'm going to present to you Helen Frankenthaler is one of this groups of these abstract expressionists. She came a little bit later than Lee. She was called like the second wave of the New York artists. And Clement Greenberg was an art critic. And here's a photo of the group at the beach, enjoying themselves. The ocean is probably about 7 miles from where I am right now. So Helen Frankenthaler is famous for this pouring and soaking technique, where she would use the canvas unprimed. So the liquid paint would soak into the canvas and make these beautiful transparent layers. So similar to Pollock, she's working from all four sides on the floor, but she is working with these broad areas of beautiful translucent color. And there she is pictured in Life magazine. So she was a rising star at the age of 23. She was in New York City and, really fiercely determined to be an artist. She had come from a very wealthy family. Her father was a New York Supreme Court justice, and she chose to live the artist life. So she meets Clement Greenberg, who is much older than her. I forget the age difference, but she was 23. I think he was like 40 or something like that. Anyway, so this is one of her early works. Mountains and Sea. This is one of her first poured paintings. And the relationship between the two of them, Clement Greenberg was very, very influential in supporting the abstract expressionist artists who were very new at that time, right? So they were very clear in their relationship that he would not advance Helen's career because she didn't want people to think that her career was advanced because she was sleeping with Clement Greenberg, so to speak. So she really didn't gain a lot of advantages from being his girlfriend, other than that they traveled within the same circles. And of course, she met a lot of other artists and poets and so on through him. But he never gave her any advantages in terms of gallery showings and things of that nature, or writing about her work. In fact, when they broke up, they had a 5-year relationship. He never wrote about her, and he never wrote about any female artist. And it is noted that Helen Frankenthaler was probably the first color field painter. And then when Rothko and other male artists went to her studio, they started using some of the same techniques of translucent color, but she was not credited for any of that in her own day, for her influence. So later on, she meets the painter Robert Motherwell, and they marry. And they're really a perfect match because they're both from wealthy families and they're both painters. And this is a happy story. Okay, I'm glad to tell a happy story. They're having a great time. They travel, they have art in common, they get along well. There was a 13-year age difference. They went to Spain. They worked side by side, and they influenced each other's work in terms of, he was famous for collage. Helen tried a little collage. She was famous for her pour technique, her staining. He tried some staining in his work, but ultimately their work was actually very, very different. Hers was much more personal, and his was a little more motivated by political issues. And obviously the paintings look completely different. And Helen did help raise his 2 daughters from his previous marriage. So she was a stepmom, but she never had children of her own. And after 13 years of marriage, they divorced. And she never really, neither of them ever said why. Okay. So I'm just going to stop the screen share just to take a little break. Any questions so far? Any comments? Okay, just for a little breather, because it's a lot to take in. Let me just go outside with you and show you the beautiful property and why it attracted so many of these abstract expressionist artists who eventually moved here and then divided their time between this area and New York City, many of them. And even Pollock and Krasner, after they moved here, they still went back to New York to socialize, to go to galleries and so on, especially in the winter. So just for fun, let me show you how pretty it is. And you feel free if you have any questions.
So I also own the book, the Fierce Poise book, where you got the quote from.
Very good.
And I thought they had split up because his alcoholism got to be too much for her.
Which one? Clement?
No, Helen Frankenthaler and Robert Motherwell. I thought they split up because of his drinking, mainly.
Oh, I didn't read the book, so you might be right. The research I did, I didn't come across that, but if you might be right.
Well, and he was, I mean, the whole thing with like his first wife and her relationship with the girls and trying to get those girls back, and the fact that I don't know how supportive he was and or how much, he really stood up for Helen during all that stuff. But it seemed to me, it's been a little while since I've read it. I've got it like right over there. It seemed to me what finally just kind of broke the proverbial camel's back was his drinking. She just
Okay,
trying to take care of the girls and him just got to be too much.
Yeah, I do appreciate that because I'm not claiming to be an expert on every detail of these
Well,
relationships.
I'm not
So
either.
anybody chime in and add details, or if you think I say something and you think it's wrong, just share. That's good.
Well, and while I'm on, just real quick, the was the portrayal of the relationship between Clement Greenberg and Pollock as in the Ed Harris movie, was that pretty true to fact? Because the movie portrayed them as being fairly involved in each other's lives.
I
I
haven't
don't know if
seen the movie in a really long time, but Clement Greenberg really was a supporter of Pollock's work above and beyond all the other artists.
Mhm.
He just thought Pollock was a genius. So Pollock rose way to the top of the group, and then everybody else followed. But at that time, Pollock was the star, and that was in part because of Clement Greenberg. Okay. Thank
Yep.
you. And thank you for mentioning the book. And we're going to continue with our art couples. And here's the book. So thank you. I haven't read the book. So this is good recommended reading. And I like the title. Okay, so next up is Robert Rauschenberg, who he comes after the abstract expressionists. And he was, in his early days, married to Susan Wheel. And they made these photograms. And on the left, you see the process where it was directly printing photos onto light-sensitive paper using her figure, her body, blocking the light to create the photo image. Okay, now he went off to teach at Black Mountain College, and while he was away, she divorced him because it did turn out that he was gay. So the most famous relationship, one of the most famous of all the modern artists, are Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. So here they're shown in their New York City studio. They worked originally side by side in different studios and then one above the other. And they were both considered to sort of be a link between the abstract expressionists and later on the pop artists, such as Andy Warhol and so on. And so they come later, they're in the 1950s, working after Pollock, and they're reacting against, in some ways, the pure abstract expressionists. So what Robin Rauschenberg does is they're really, really poor. So he goes into the streets of New York City. He collects all sorts of debris. He even takes his old bed and, magazine pictures, newspaper pictures, all sorts of stuff that he finds, and he incorporates it into the art. So it's a combine, right? It's combining sculpture, painting, collage, and you could see it's combining familiar images, right? Such as newspaper images, or even a bed, with this very, very personalized abstract expressionist painting and dripping and so on, right? Similarly, Jasper Johns is also working with images you can recognize. Iconic images like the American flag or a target or even a map. And so he's using these pre-existing images to create painting. Okay, and this does not have a lot of emotion in it, this map. I mean, this flag, right? It's not like Jackson Pollock. It's not like spilling out with energy and emotion. It's a little more conceptual in a way, but these paintings in real life are very beautifully done. They're very textured. And they were together for, let me just see my notes for a moment. Sorry. Yeah. They, I think they were together for 5 years, yeah. And in 1961, they broke up because of irreconcilable differences. And they had a really bitter, bitter breakup. And Jasper Johns does this series of gray paintings around the time of their breakup, which really speak, you might say these speak to loss, right? When your world just becomes gray. Next up is Jacob Lawrence and Gwendolyn Knight. Jacob Lawrence was working in the 30s. They both had somewhat difficult lives. And what was really, really helpful for both of the artists was the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which supported artists by giving workshops as well as hiring painters and mural artists. And Lee and Pollock were also part of the WPA. So Lawrence was a teenager. He was 17 years old. He was taking a class, enrolled in the school in Harlem for the WPA. And Gwendolyn Knight was older than him. She was a WPA artist. And that's how they met. And it's a happy story. They were married for 60 years and they always supported each other's art. And Lawrence this is his very, very famous migration series. He tells the stories about the African Americans migrating from the South to the North as a result of a drought. They came to the North. And this is done with many, many panels. And she actually helped him with this work by making up captions for him, with him, and also preparing the panels. Now, the big difference between their work, he does stories that are more politically charged and historically based, whereas Gwen's paintings are much more intimate and personal, right? Next up, we've all heard of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. And I chose these artists because they're all working around the same time. So Frida Kahlo, of course, these two artists are Mexican. And Frida Kahlo, whose painting is on the left, she really documented their whole relationship and painted the story of her life, which of course involved a lot about her husband, Diego Rivera. He was much older than her as well. 20 years older. Her parents were against the marriage because they were like, why are you marrying this older man who is, you know, an artist known for being a womanizer and so on and so forth. But she went ahead with the marriage and they had a very passionate, tumultuous love story. So they divorced. There was a lot of infidelity. And he had a lot of female liaisons. And she also had a lot of affairs with both men and women. The most famous one was with the revolutionary Leon Trotsky, who was staying at their house. And their work is very different. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, this is running through a lot of these men and women. His is also based in politics, history. He does these murals, leftist type murals. And there's Frida Kahlo actually pictured as a revolutionary in one of his murals in a detail. She, on the other hand, does these pictures that are really about her personal life and very intimate. So this is a portrait she did when she followed him to Detroit. He was working on a mural. And on the left, this is a a newspaper article at that time. Wife of the master mural painter gleefully dabbles in works of art. So here's an example of sexism in the media. She is one of the greatest artists in the world. She's definitely recognized as that today. And we're going to get into this February 14th at the same time, 4 o'clock. We're going to delve into how artists in their actual art tell their love stories. Okay. Okay, next up, Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz. Now, Georgia O'Keeffe is the beloved American artist who's best known for her floral paintings, her abstract floral paintings. And Alfred Stieglitz is a photographer who's also very, very famous. There was also a very big age difference between them. And he had a gallery called 291 in Manhattan on Fifth Avenue, and he represented her. And the story goes that when she first brought her art there, she left it there, and then without her permission, he put the art up, gave her an exhibit, did titles, called it woman art. And she goes there and she's like, what? Like, she was mad. She was like, who gave you permission to do this? And I didn't even want my art to be called woman art. And despite that, they fell in love, and he was married. So for years they had an affair, and eventually, well, throughout their affair and their relationship, he would photograph her. And he made these beautiful photographs of her, many of them nude, many of them very close up, very intimate. He was completely in love with her. He divorced his wife, they married, and despite his being enamored with her, he still continued to have affairs, and that eventually broke up their marriage. And O'Keeffe went into a deep depression. She had a breakdown, and she took off to New Mexico, and here she found herself. She also had affairs with women along the way. But she is best noted for these paintings where she paints the landscape. She paints very close-up abstract paintings of flowers, and she uses nature as an inspiration for her abstract art. And I'm going to paraphrase, but more or less she said that she really, in the breakup and moving to New Mexico, she found herself, right? She found her strength. She said, it makes me feel I am growing very tall and straight inside. And at the end of her life, a very much younger man took care of her and stayed with her for the rest of her life. And it's not really known if there was any kind of love affair between them, but that's kind of outside the scope of this talk. So this is a nice book that I got after I came up with this topic. I was told, oh, well, this book was written, Artists in Love. This book you can get on Amazon, and it has a lot of really nice photos in it. The text is a little, at times, there's a certain tone in the book that can be a little edgy. But I think it's an enjoyable book. I would recommend it, and it has some good information in it. So on that note, I would like to invite people to comment, to question, or to share.
Okay, give it a minute. Not yet.
Anybody? I see some friends on here. Anything surprising? Anything that maybe I put my own skew on it and you're like, I don't agree with that? Or any questions that stand out, or any other artists that you feel, oh, she didn't mention this one or that one?
Joyce, I wanted to show you, when you showed the Jacob Lawrence picture, we had gone to another event recently where they had us copy a Jacob Lawrence, and that's the one I did.
Oh, that's so good. I love that one. And Jacob Lawrence in that one, he ends on a positive note. He really paints the struggle and the injustice. And then he ends on a positive note with those three girls moving up through education. So excellent. And that's how Power Couple comes to every Zoom. Our dynamic duo. Nice to see you.
I have a question about that same artist and his wife. What type of artists would you say that, like, they weren't really the abstract expressionists as I understood it?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I don't know, I can't find who's speaking or I'd spotlight you, but anyway.
It's Lee. Mhm.
Oh, okay. He, recently I was reading and they called him an expressionist cubist. And I thought that's interesting. He's cubist in the sense that, like Picasso, synthetic cubism, he's using broad colors, collage, broad shapes, creating space by using these flat colors that and shapes that some pop out and some recede and so on. But his paintings also have a very expressive quality to them, right?
Got
But
it. Yeah.
he doesn't necessarily, not every artist, even all artists don't fall into a neat category, but that's a very good question. And I would say Gwen's would fall into the realm of expressionism because it's so personal. And the brushstrokes and the color are used to express.
Yes. Okay, thank you. This was wonderful.
Any other questions, ideas?
I feel like I'm the one doing a lot of the talking, but you really hit. I put in the comments that I've just been in rapturous joy pretty much for like the last hour or so, because you're hitting like all my artist people here. Yeah, Diego Rivera was his one of his biggest redeeming qualities, though, is that he knew and could appreciate the talent and the power of Frida Kahlo's work while she was still here, and promoted her. He knew that she had a quality in her work that he wasn't capable of, just because of like his background and his interests and stuff, but he recognized how powerful her stuff was and appreciated what she did and made sure that others appreciated it too. I
Yeah.
mean, he was a big promoter, did not stifle her in any way, and just, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And there's many other examples of female artists outside the scope of this talk whose partners definitely promoted them and believed in them. I'm reading now about Joan Mitchell, and I forget the name of her partner, but he was totally behind her. And also a lot of the fathers really were behind these women as well. So like
Frida had a wonderful dad. Frida's dad was
Frida's
wonderful.
dad, Helen Frankenthaler's dad, the Supreme Court justice, he just really believed in his daughter. And my own dad, I was reading about it and I was like, you know what? My dad was like that. He grew up in the 40s and 50s. He was from that generation. You know, my mom was a stay-at-home mom. That was their marriage. He didn't see that for me. He was a champion. So that's a blessing, you know, when we support each other, regardless of gender, regardless of anything, right? Give each other space to use our gifts. So thank you. Good point. Anybody else? Anyone want to add to the story?
There's
And
a
I-
question in the chat from a Nick who's asked, are there any dynamic duos in the art world today?
There sure are. Well, what the first couple that comes to mind is a local couple living in Sag Harbor, and they are April Gornick and Eric Fischel, who not only are they both amazing painters, they're both activists in terms of giving back to the community. They created what's called the Church Art Center in Sag Harbor, and they also spearheaded the renovation of the Sag Harbor Cinema, which is a thriving art center. It's not just a cinema. And so that is the first couple that comes to mind. Also, there's many couples historically who actually collaborated with each other. So one of them is Klaus Oldenburg, and you're going to kill me. I can't remember his wife's name. Who knows Klaus Oldenburg's wife's name? See, this is what the women I kind of, you know, they're not as historically prominent. And that's why I can't remember. And another one is Christo and his wife, who I'm sorry, I can't remember, Jean Claude. So you might want to look those up as well. This, and also even within the era I talked about, there's many, many other artists who were couples. Picasso, there was Max Ernst, and many other people. Any other questions? Or does
I
anyone want to add to that?
I just had a question, and it might not relate to this at all, so you can pass it if need be. But I was told by an art teacher that Picasso was very violent in terms of domestic violence and things like that. And I always wondered if that was true. That is it a known fact?
I'm not sure if Picasso was violent, but he was known for being abusive. I don't know if he was actually physically abusive. Maybe somebody else knows. Does somebody else know?
I don't think he was physically abusive. I think he was just cruel.
He was just known for being abusive, verbally
It was
abusive.
abuse. Okay.
Or
Right.
just
You have, like-
psychically abusive. I mean, just, yeah.
Okay. Well,
A lot of these stories, just like any stories, they get twisted and turned, right? Like the other day, I heard Pollock didn't leave paint, and I asked the director, I was like, is that true? And she said, no, not at all.
No.
So good question. Now, I'll tell you- Mhm.
A great movie. Well, I think it's a great movie. And I think it's also mildly historically accurate. I want to say it's called O'Keeffe, all about Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz. Joan Allen plays Georgia O'Keeffe, and Jeremy Irons is Alfred Stieglitz. And it's a good movie.
I think I'm
It's a-
going to watch that tonight. Yeah, there's some, well, okay, on these artists, and thank you. You're awesome. You're like my co-host because you're
I'm sorry. It's like I said, you're hitting all my people today. And I'm just like, oh, I got so much to say. I got so much to say.
thank you because I forgot to mention the movies. Thank you. No, really, seriously, I appreciate it. Yes, that one, and then of course Pollock with Ed Harris, and then there's Frida with Selma Hayek, I love that movie. And what other one? Oh, and there is one about Picasso and his relationships with Anthony Hopkins. That wasn't that good of a movie, but it's fun to watch.
There
So
is also a great, you can just go onto YouTube and Google Frida Kahlo documentary, and there's a wonderful PBS documentary about Frida. Life and Times of Frida Kahlo, I think it's called. And just within the last couple of years, there is a new documentary about her that was made after they uncovered a lot of her personal artifacts in the house that hadn't been previously shown. So they made another documentary about that. I want to say it's probably not even 3 or 4 years old. If you've got Amazon Prime or whatever, yeah, I bought it because I had to have it. So it's really good too. There's lots of great stuff out there.
thank you so much. I'll tell you what, everybody, we're going to have to end, but I want to make an announcement. You can go to pkhouse.org to see all of our various Zoom programs. Tomorrow, we're going to have John Toriano speaking, and that's going to be about the cosmic realm, inner and outer space. That's going to be amazing. And then related to this topic, on February 14th, we're going to have art lovers. And we're going to, different than this one, we're going to look at art that expresses love in partnership and the trials and tribulations. So we'll look at Chagall and Matisse and many other artists. And then we're going to do a hands-on workshop where you get to draw or paint something about love. Okay? So everybody, I really, really appreciate you coming. And it was really fun to research and think about this topic. And have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
so much.